Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that following the Revolutionary War, numerous Continental officers were promised lifetime pensions? And that these officers were so upset that they probably weren't going to get these pensions that they almost staged a mutiny in order to get their compensation, only to be persuaded away from this decision by none other than George Washington. And that a document drafted in 1776 and finally signed in 1781, yes, during the war, the Articles of Confederation, not the Constitution, was the first government of the United States. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because we will cover that and more in episode 73, the Newburgh Conspiracy and the Articles of Confederation. All right, everyone, welcome back to class. It is great to be back. I took about 2 or 3 weeks off over the holidays. I appreciate your patience. I did not have the foresight to announce it on episode 72, which I clearly should have, but I put it up on Twitter @ateachershist. If you don't follow me, any updates for the pod that aren't done live in front of the microphone will be up on Twitter or on Facebook at Teacher's History of the United States podcast. I was out of state. I was in 3 different states visiting a bunch of family over the holidays, and it just was not going to be feasible to be able to do all the research, the writing, and the recording because we sort of are doing this as we go. So anyway, thank you so much for being patient, and now we're back, and now we're going to dive into Unit 4 now, and we're going to begin with the post-Revolutionary War history. But real quick, I got a message via Twitter from Malad. He is a listener from the New Jersey, New York area with a bit of a fact check. And he says, Chris, I'm a listener to your podcast. Great work and thank you. Listening to the extra credit on the Declaration of Independence right now. You mentioned at one point William Franklin was the governor of Pennsylvania at that time. Well, he wasn't. He was the governor of New Jersey. Then I went back a few episodes to the Ben Franklin episode and re-listened to some parts. There you mentioned he was the governor of New England and his father got roasted in Parliament while he was governor of New England, but he was actually the royal governor of New Jersey from 1763 to 1776. I thought I had to mention this to you. Once again, thanks for your terrific pod. Malad, thank you for reaching out, and thank you for correcting me, because you are correct. William Franklin was the royal governor of New Jersey from 1763 to 1776. And this is sort of not only to fact check me, but also to let you guys know if you come across anything that seems fishy or maybe doesn't seem right, please let me know, because I'm far more interested in getting it right than being right. And after this episode, we will be 73 episodes into this podcast and tens and tens and tens of thousands of words of U.S. history. So I'm sure I've had some other slip-ups here and there. So just let me know. Anyway, let's dive into the beginning of Unit 4, the post-war America. Now, during the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that ended the Revolutionary War, what the Americans came to find was that some of the borders weren't as well defined as they would have liked, and not all of the promises from the Treaty of Paris came to fruition. But in the end, it was an incredible piece of diplomacy for Franklin, Adams, and Jay. Back in the colonies, the Continental Army had won the Battle of Yorktown, and the Americans had decided to head north toward New York City. Sitting in New York and not having much to do, many of these men had a lot of free time to think about just how difficult the war was, how much they'd sacrificed for their country, and how passionate they were about the cause. We also know that throughout the war, Congress had not really given them the financial or logistical support they needed, while promises of timely pay were broken time and time again. Now that the war was coming to an end, and the real-world financial issues were staring these men straight in the face, you can understand why they weren't convinced that Congress was going to come through with their pensions as promised. And we know that Congress didn't really have anything they could do about it. They were reliant on payments from the states, but these payments were, I should say, little more than, donations. There was nothing Congress could do to make the states pay the money they, quote, owe. All they can do is ask pretty please and cross their fingers. And this was not a great reality for many of these soldiers who had been promised lofty payments, such as pension for the rest of their lives and back pay that goes back years. I mean, some even all the way to the beginning of the war itself. It was crazy. And this is a huge issue for many of them. Some of them hadn't been working their land or paying their bills consistently for years, convinced that, maybe they would end up in debtor's prison or have to default on their land, made them a bit anxious to step back out into society. And interestingly enough, it was at this point that some in the Army wanted George Washington to take control of this situation, basically step into this new enormous power vacuum that was left from the king and parliament abdicating control of the colonies and assume some type of dictatorial powers, right? Similar to how some of the Roman senators wanted Cincinnatus to do the same. Heck, even Alexander Hamilton thought that Washington needed to do something of this sort in order for this to work itself out the way it was supposed to. But as we've talked about, George Washington was the American Cincinnatus. He wasn't going to do something like this, and he wrote back to Hamilton informing him of his decision, one that Hamilton had, I'm sure, mixed feelings about. Once the word spread to Washington's officers, some of them were not having any of it. And this brings us to the Newburgh Conspiracy of March 1783, just when you thought Washington was finished putting out fires in the Continental Army. He had one of his most difficult challenges at hand. Following the war, as I just mentioned, the Army was located in New York, but Newburgh, New York to be specific. It's about 60 miles north of the Big Apple, or whatever its nickname was back in the 18th century, and they were there to keep an eye on British-occupied New York City at that time. In 1782, so prior to the end of the war, but coming up on the end, when most of the payments to the soldiers began to peter out or stop altogether, the aggrieved parties began to send their memos and petitions to the Congress, but to no avail. And specifically, we're talking about the officers here, not just the regular soldiers. But it wasn't just memos and petitions. Led by none other than General Henry Knox, these men also submitted a memorandum to Congress. They more or less said that they were worried that since their pay had been stalled, they were particularly not so confident in their pensions coming through, and, that's a logical conclusion to make. And while they recognized that the pensions may not be able to be paid, they said they would take a lump sum payment instead. They also wanted Congress to know that, by the way, this was no idle threat. They stated that, quote, any further experiments on their patients may have fatal effects. It had become evident to many in Congress that this was a serious issue and needed to be dealt with. But there was a big problem. The Treasury? Well, that was empty. Additionally, Congress, as much as they desired it, did not have the power to compel individual states to provide funds to meet their obligations. Another important wrinkle is that some of the states had even forbid their representatives from signing anything that supported the idea of a pension. In January of 1783, the officers' representatives and congressional representatives met to try to find a solution, but they got nowhere. By February, nationalists in Congress had twice proposed a bill that would allow Congress to adopt some type of pension for the soldiers, but it was shot down. And you may be wondering, why would nationalists like, say Alexander Hamilton want a pension for the soldiers? Well, they figured if they could get the precedent of creating this pension for the soldiers, that would allow them a bit of an opening to begin to make an argument that Congress, in fact, did have the power to tax and to raise revenue. So they were seeing this as sort of the first step to a larger expansion of the extremely limited governing body in the United States at the time, or I guess technically it's not the U.S. yet. They haven't signed the treaty yet, but you know what I mean. But the Nationalists failed to get Congress to adopt this, so instead they turned to the soldiers at Newburgh and suggested that they begin to consider actions that could, at least optically, represent a mutiny, even if it wasn't like a real mutiny. That way, maybe the Nationalists in Congress would gain more leverage and find success in devising this pension plan. With the preliminary peace agreement in place over in Paris, tensions began to rise even more, and time was of the essence. Hamilton, a noted nationalist, like I mentioned, wrote to Washington warning him of the potential unrest and recommended that he, quote, take the direction of the army's anger. Washington, in response, informed Hamilton that he would engage in no such actions that would see the army pose any type of threat to Congress, and with Knox following up shortly after, repeating pretty much the exact same sentiment, the Nationalists turned to Plan B. While the letters from Washington and Knox lessened the threat, they did not kill it off completely, because on March 10th, a letter by the aide to General Horatio Gates began to circulate. And I do think it's important for a quick sidebar here. Remember, Horatio Gates was the general that, well, he got embarrassed at the Battle of Camden, but for much of the war, he was viewed as like the alternative to Washington. And believe it or not, even after he ran away, literally like over 100 miles, ran from a battle, he was still viewed as a possible alternative to Washington if Washington wasn't willing to do what he needed to do to get these officers their pension. So the fact that on March 10th, a letter by the aide of Horatio Gates, well, this is pretty important. What did the letter say? Well, it detailed the detestable state of the army and demanded that the men give an ultimatum to Congress to meet their pension request. Additionally, that same day, an anonymous letter called for a meeting of the officers the next day on the 11th. Washington, hearing that an anonymous letter was sent out requesting this meeting, refused to allow any type of official meeting of his officers to be called by, no one in particular. He rescheduled the meeting for March 15th and said that the most senior ranking officer would preside over it, which was assumed to be, Horatio Gates. While Gates opened the meeting, Washington, to everyone's surprise, arrived. Sort of like, surprise, your honorable, esteemed leader is here just in time to hear you bitch and moan and foment illegal rebellion. Gates, obviously shocked that Washington was there, relinquished the floor and gave him permission to speak to his men. When Washington looked out, he could tell that these men were tired, exhausted, and likely angry and bitter. They did not show him the respect or deference that he had become used to throughout the war. Washington then gave a short and passionate speech, deriding the men for their actions and proclaiming that they should stand against anyone, quote, who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood. Then he began to pull out a letter from his jacket, written by a member of Congress. Written in handwriting other than his own, Washington then reached into his other pocket to pull out his new pair of eyeglasses. After fumbling with the letter and his glasses for a moment, he then turned to his men and said, quote, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service to my country." After this statement, it hit the men in the room like a ton of bricks. Remember, this was a meeting of the officers. These were men who had worked with Washington for years and at times right by his side. They realized in this moment, at least it's believed now, they realized that he had sacrificed just as much, if not more, for this war than they had. Reports are that many of the men were moved to tears, and it was at this moment that the conspiracy of rebellion died. Following this letter, Washington left, and General Knox took over. Then they wrote a resolution stating their unshakable confidence in Congress and denounced the letters from earlier in the week about their state of unhappiness. Which, of course, a couple of the people in the room were not too happy about, since most of the men were on board with those letters just a few days earlier. There were a few more instances of unease throughout the ending of the war in the Continental Army and with officers, but none as serious as this one. Congress decided to give each officer 5 years full pay and each soldier 3 months full pay to make up for their treasury problems. The Newburgh affair is believed by some to be carefully orchestrated, potentially by Knox and Washington. And look, maybe it was, but believing that it happened organically is certainly the more emotionally appealing version, and that's the one I like to believe in. In the end, the idea of civilian control over the military was reaffirmed, and Washington, as the leading proponent of this civilian control, was clear to everyone, even if it damaged his reputation with some of his officers and soldiers. And this leads us to our third segment for today, which is the government that the United States of America was operating under when the war ended. And no, it was not the Constitution. It was, in fact, the Articles of Confederation. That's actually a pretty popular, bar trivia question, so you'll want to hang on to that one. Back in 1776, once the colonies declared their independence, they needed some type of legal basis for a permanent union of the states. So, the Second Continental Congress decided that they were going to draft a national constitution for the United States. The committee they chose to do this was headed up by none other than John Dickinson, famous now on this podcast for a few different reasons, but most notably for his ardent fight against British taxation in his pamphlet titled Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. Not surprisingly, there was considerable debate over this document when it left committee. The government that they came up with had a national government that was to be superior to the states. The national government would have a Congress, and they would hold pretty much all the power that weren't left specifically to the states. And you can imagine how some of the delegates probably responded to that. I mean, many of them were likely thinking something along the lines of, hold on a second. You want us to advocate for the rights of our local and state governments, fight a war to free ourselves from the shackles of a tyrannical central government, and simultaneously pass a bill that will create a new, superior central government that is given broad governing authority? You out of your mind? By November of 1776, they finally had a draft of government that many of them could agree on, and this draft gave most of the power to the states. And when I mean most of the power, I mean almost all of the domestic governing power was given to the states. It's sort of comical how useless this idea of their central government was at this point in American history. After about a year of debate, Congress finally submitted the Articles of Confederation to the states. It stated that, quote, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence in every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. Basically, this created a very loose confederation of autonomous states, hence the name Articles of Confederation. So they were like one country, but sort of also totally independent at the same time. And like I said, the powers given to the federal government were extremely limited. There were no provision for a national judiciary or a separate executive branch. So no judicial branch, no executive branch. The only branch of government the Articles of Confederation had was a legislative branch. And guess what? Each state, no matter how big, no matter how many people it had one vote in Congress. Yes, that's right. Exactly one vote. They all had the exact same amount of voting power. Now, they could vote on measures like finances, war, or peace, But they needed 9 of the 13 votes to pass, which, at first blush, okay, that seems fair. But to tax, there needed to be unanimous consent of all the states. That's right, unanimous consent. So if one state did not support the tax, then they couldn't do it. Good luck with that. Primarily, the Articles gave Congress their power in the arena of foreign affairs. Congress could declare war, make peace, negotiate with Native Americans, and settle disputes between the states. Once again, it had no power to impose any taxes on the states unless they had a unanimous consent, and really all it could do was ask the states to supply troops and money, and they had to hope that the states would comply with their request. While the Articles were approved by most states right away, Maryland did not approve it until 1781. Since it took unanimous consent, technically, it did not become official until 1781. So why did Maryland hold out so vigorously? Well, it was all about Western land. Maryland's western border is sandwiched between Pennsylvania and present-day West Virginia, which at the time was, of course, still the state of Virginia. Since Maryland's western border doesn't extend far enough, and because it wasn't in their founding charter, they couldn't join with the chorus of other states in laying claim to land in the West. Recognizing how disadvantaged they would be in their future, Maryland demanded that this unclaimed land be given to the national government to be divvied up fairly after the war. With Britain bearing down on the Chesapeake in 1781, it was Virginia that finally gave up some of their western land claims, and with them relenting, Maryland also decided to fall in line. Now that Virginia had given up its western land claims, no one else was holding out any western land claims, and Maryland agreed to the terms. So there we have it. The war is over, we have started Unit 4, and are moving forward with this interlude, so to speak, in United States history, in between the Revolutionary War and the Constitutional period. Next week, we'll dive deeper into how this federal government, with its extremely limited domestic power, faced its first major test in Shays' Rebellion. Thanks for your patience and for staying with us through this few-week respite for me to enjoy the holidays and set the research aside for a little bit. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate everything you guys do and how much you're enjoying this podcast, and hopefully how much you're learning along with me. So, thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.